Hello and welcome to the Royal Beat Book Club with me, Sarah Hewson. In this series, we look at the best royal books in print, reading between the lines to uncover the secrets, stories and scandals of the monarchy. In this episode, we'll be turning the pages of Katie Nicholl's book, The New Royals, Queen Elizabeth's Legacy and the Future of the Crown. We'll discuss how the late Queen balanced monarchy with motherhood, how she navigated the more testing times, which often involved her children's personal lives. And we'll give our views on how her eldest son is taking to his role as King Charles. Well, here with me in the studio, I'm delighted to have Katie Nicholl, royal biographer Ingrid Seward, and former spokesperson to Queen Elizabeth II, Dickie Arbiter. A very warm welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Now, Katie, your book came out just a few weeks after the death of the Queen, and obviously it was a very long time in the making. But just talk to me about publication at that particular moment, how it felt.
It was an extraordinary experience. So my publishers are US publishers. They were Hachette. And, I'd had this idea for the book for a while. I think we all knew that the Queen was very much in her twilight years, and I wanted to do the book that would sort of celebrate her life, reflect on her reign, but also, importantly, project forward to the future and look at what the future held. And there was no urgency on the part of the American publishers. I mean, at one point, I think the plan for this book was just to sort of sit in a warehouse for several months before it was going to be, dispatched around the world. And I was getting more and more nervous about that. And I thought, no, that there's the potential for things to change very quickly here, which is, of course, exactly what happened. I think both of you would agree that with books like this, so much of it is in the timing. The success of a book like this very much depends on the timing. And when the Queen died, I mean, the book was all done, right? Everything was done. And I said to them, well, we need to get this out quickly. And so the advantage of being with a big American publishing arm like Hachette is that the machinery was in place to get those books out at lightning speed. So actually, the first books were on the shelf the day after the funeral. Wow. which as an author is incredible, but then I also didn't want to be accused of cashing in on the Queen's death. It was that fine balance. As you say, this book was many years in the making, but there was an appetite for all things about the Queen, particularly something that celebrated her life after her death.
And of course, particularly with the title, her legacy and the future of the Crown. And actually, your very final chapter is looking at that, the Platinum Jubilee, and how she had paved the way for the succession as well. Did her death change anything about the book? Did you make any changes at that point?
Well, of course, the hardback came out first, so there was a period between the hardback and the paperback where I was actually able to include a chapter on the funeral and obviously bring it as up to date as I possibly could before it went to print for the next edition. We put a new cover on it, and yes, I mean, we did what we could. But I suppose, as a writer for Vanity Fair, the beauty of being able to publish a blog, it's so instantaneous. A book like this, it is completely different. So I'll pick it up now and think, gosh, I'd love it to feel a bit more contemporaneous. But obviously, that's the nature of a book. But I think it's an overall look back on her reign, and it was sort of wonderful doing that dance through the decades. And I think what struck me most in writing this was her evolution through the decades, how she allowed the family to evolve, and how she was there for all of us through such important moments, and how much she witnessed and she saw change.
And it's a question that we all reflected on a lot in September 2022, trying to sum up the life and the legacy of someone who'd been so much a part of our lives for so long. What would you say is her greatest legacy, Katie?
I think that steadfast devotion to duty, it will always be her legacy. But I think also the fact that she has enabled monarchy, that age-old institution, to be something that is still relevant today, because it is. Of course, King Charles has picked up where Queen Elizabeth II left off, but she paved the way for it to move into a modern era. And that was largely down to her ability to evolve. And she was never too far ahead of the curve and never too far behind it. She was always just in the right in the right place.
And of course, leaving behind 3 heirs as well.
Male heirs as well. So after the longest reigning female monarch of all time, we have 3 kings.
Now, as we know, Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip had 4 children: Charles, Anne, Andrew and Edward. She first became a parent before she was queen. What sort of a mother figure was she, Ingrid?
Well, I think she was really keen to slightly change the way that she brought up her children, which of course looked very good at the time when she got married, and she had Prince Charles literally practically a year to the day after her wedding, and she said, "I want to bring him up, you know, to be have a normal life." But of course there is no such thing as a normal life for a member of the royal family, and there still isn't. So this desire for normality just doesn't really exist. It's toned down. I think the Waleses have really managed to tone it down, but certainly back in the 50s, when Charles was born, it was very little they could do. And then, of course, 4 years after he was born, so he was born in 48, and her father died in 52, and suddenly this young girl, 26, had the weight of the crown on her shoulders. And it was a very different world then. It was so much of a man's world. And they weren't used to women being in positions of power. So she had all that to take on as well as motherhood. So I think she was at a massive disadvantage.
And even before that, while her father was unwell and she'd had to take on a lot of the overseas duties, I mean, she was having to leave those young children, Charles and Anne, for many months at a time, Dickie. I mean, Ingrid there mentioning the Waleses doing things differently. I mean, that would be unheard of now, wouldn't it?
That would be unheard of now. Yes, her father was supposed to go to Canada, but he was too ill. He had a lung removed in 1949, and they went to Canada, she and Prince Philip, and they had to leave Charles behind. Anne wasn't yet born. She wasn't born until 1950. Very difficult, but she always put duty first. A lot of criticism as a result of that, because they felt, and Charles said in an interview in '94, he was sorry about his childhood, that he felt that he hadn't had a proper childhood, parental-wise.
He had a very close relationship with the Queen Mother, though.
Very close relationship with the Queen Mother, very close relationship with his aunt, Princess Margaret, because they were constant, because the Queen and Prince Philip were away all the time. Look at that after the coronation, a 6-month tour of the Commonwealth, leaving the children behind. Doesn't happen today, because we've seen William and Catherine take their children. We saw the King and late Diana, Princess of Wales, take their children. But it was totally unheard of in that reign.
I mean, this is 1951, one from the family albums that's subsequently been released on the Clarence House Instagram account. You can see the formality as well, can't you? The Duke of Edinburgh there in his, shirt and tie, and very different. There's a big age gap as well, Ingrid, between Charles and Anne, and then Andrew and Edward, by which point she was established as queen.
Yes.
How do you think that changed the way she might have raised the children?
Well, she certainly raised Edward and Andrew differently. She would really get involved in their schoolwork, for instance, which she never was really able to with Charles and Anne. I mean, Anne went off to school at Benenden and her mum took her there and everything, but she couldn't really get involved because she didn't have time. So it was left to other people. But with Edward and with Andrew, she got very, very involved. They were at a school called Heatherdown, and years ago, I actually interviewed the headmaster, and he was telling me what a wonderful parent the Queen was. And she'd come to all the sports days, all the sort of nativities. I mean, you know that. It's quite time-consuming, yes, all the things that children do. And only very, very occasionally would she miss anything. And then the Queen Mother came instead. So, and she discussed all their reports and took a great deal of interest. And it was very near Windsor Castle, so she wasn't far from them.
it's almost as if she was able to enjoy being a mother more in that second phase.
And I think I sort of write that in the book. It was almost like she saw it as a second chance. The second time round, she was able to do things differently. I mean, I think most mothers would say that when they have the second child, you're a bit more relaxed. You know the drill a bit better, and I think you do things. And
you know that, Katie.
Yes, I do. I do things. I do things in a different way with my second. So, you know, as you say, there was this big age gap between Charles and Anne and Andrew and Edward, and I think she was. I just think it was wonderful that she was almost able to have a sort of second chance at being. I use the word hands-on mother, but I actually didn't realise, Ingrid, that she'd been able to go to sports days and things like that, which is wonderful that she was able to do that. But I think she found her feet more in this very male-dominated world where she was queen. She had quite a few years of being queen now under her belt, and that probably gave her the confidence to say, well, actually, I'm going to take this time to...
We've also got to remember what the UK was at that particular time in the 50s.
Well, Katie wouldn't remember. She wasn't born.
Yes.
She wasn't born.
I wasn't. You'll have to tell me.
And me.
The empire had disappeared, but the Commonwealth in the late 40s was still called the British Commonwealth. That fell away in the 50s, and there was a means of keeping the Commonwealth together, and that lady was the means of keeping it together. So she was incredibly busy sort of keeping the whole Commonwealth together. By the time we got to the 60s, they were all seeking independence away from the crown, which meant that her job was slightly easier. I mean, today we're living in an age where the king is head of state of 15 members of the Commonwealth. Before, it was every member of the Commonwealth. So that fell away. So she had a very important role. She was the catalyst in keeping the Commonwealth together, which is what it is today.
And they were brought up quite frugally too. I mean, just looking at that photograph, it's wonderful. Look at the turn-ups on Andrew and Edward.
It's interesting because I was going to say, what lessons have they learned from being raised by the Queen? I mean, you talk about them frugal. Charles is certainly still very frugal, isn't he? The mend and make do kind of mantra with shoes and his clothing and turning all the lights off and...
Yes, I think the Queen started that, turning the lights off. I think it's the Scottish blood in her. So there was a great... I think it was also people that were born, you know, that were around during the war, were very, very careful about things like that. But Charles is very spoilt, but he's taken on this completely new mantra of wearing old clothes, mended clothes, and then even his wonderful polished shoes.
He's always worn old clothes.
Well, they must have been new at one stage.
They were new at one stage, but I remember out with him on an engagement. I can't remember where it was. It was certainly in the UK. And you could see the men's in his suits. And if you look at his suits, they don't fit properly.
No, they don't, do they?
They're slightly crumpled.
And his coats, there's one wonderful one with really baggy pockets, which is
so well used.
The brown one.
Yes.
Yes, and he's had that for years.
But it's the shoes that I love, the sort of you know, there's gorgeous shoes which cost hundreds of pounds because they're handmade, but they're patched and patched.
Yes, but you see, he's worn them for so long, they're comfortable.
Yes.
Why break in a new pair?
Well, the juggling act of being monarch and mother became even more challenging, didn't it, as the children started to grow up, started to make decisions for themselves. A lot of the problems, past and present, Dickie, have involved television appearances. There aren't many examples where they've gone well for them. I want to turn to 1987, Dickie.
Yes.
A monumental faux pas.
It was a monumental faux pas.
I'll let you explain what happened.
That one, and Edward did it again when he was producing television. I'll get to that in a few seconds. The Royal Knockout was an extravaganza for charity. Fair enough. Using the royals as patron of charity, not the right thing. They could have been there as spectators, not as participants. And it had been presented as a fait accompli. The contracts were signed, everybody was booked, the film crews were in place, the venue was in place. They couldn't actually dismantle it because it would have made a bigger story, and it would have been...
Even if the Queen had said, you know what, no.
She wouldn't have done it.
Would she not have put her foot down?
She wouldn't have put her foot down. You know, if we go all those years ahead to 2019 and that interview that her second eldest son did for Newsnight, she knew there was an interview, but she didn't know what it was about, and she didn't put her foot down. But you see, Edward had signed a deal So it was impossible to dismantle it. And he did the same when he was a television producer, signing a deal for, I think it was the E! channel in the States, A to Z of monarchy.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah, we were both on that.
It was all signed and sealed, so they couldn't dismantle it. And that's how he presented. That was a disaster. I was actually there in the tent watching on television.
Were you watching it through your hands?
It was excruciating. And then when he came in at the end of the filming, he sat at a chair, and there was a table, it was a slightly raised platform, and there was silence. Could hear a pin drop.
Because everyone knew it was awful.
Yeah, and he said, well, what did you think of it? Which was a big mistake. And there was still silence. Well, was the second time. And then he stomped out, and the headline in the tabloids the following day, it's a walkout.
How did the Queen react afterwards?
It's done. There's not a lot she can say, is there, unfortunately.
It was the Queen Mother that was really upset.
Oh, she was...
She said, to think that this has ruined almost everything that I've spent my life doing. She got very dramatic about it.
She did.
I mean, that wasn't true at all, but she was very upset by it. She thought it was so undignified, which it was.
What's so extraordinary is it didn't put them off doing more television, because, of course, they allowed the cameras back in again, didn't they, for the royal family documentary?
That was before.
That was before. That was in '69.
Oh, yes, of course.
That was an idea, and at the time it was a good idea, because nobody knew who these people were. They'd seen pictures of them, they'd seen newsreel pictures, but they didn't know who they were. So Bill Heseltine, who's an Australian, was a very good press secretary, and he came up with this idea of a documentary of the royal family, and it kind of worked in the day. But it wouldn't work today because it was contrived.
There was also the feeling, wasn't it, that if you pull back that velvet curtain too much, you take away the mystique.
Yeah.
And that the royal family relies on that mystique. And of course, it's a very different world we live in now, and we've discussed it a lot with the video released by the Princess of Wales, for example. How much do you give in the social media age and when you're trying to reach out to the next generation? If we thought that the royal knockout was difficult and embarrassing for the royal family, there was a lot worse to come, wasn't there? 1992, 5 years later, the annus horribilis, as it was described by the late Queen, starting with the separation of the Yorks early that year. How did the Queen deal with those very personal issues being so prominent in the public domain, Dickie?
With great disappointment, and it wasn't going to stop there, because you had the Yorks, then you had the Princess Royal, and then you had the Waleses at the end of that year. It was all falling apart. 3 of her children were separating, which would ultimately lead to divorce. And being a religious person, being the head of the Church of England, the sanctity, the sacredness of marriage, she believed in that. And to see her children marriages fall apart was incredibly disappointing. Her concern primarily was for the children. How would they take it? Because the adults go off and do their own thing, but it's the children who suffer. So she was incredibly concerned for them and very disappointed in her own children.
I mean, there must have been, Ingrid, some extremely red faces over the breakfast table as the newspapers were delivered in the morning. Not least of all, let's look at the Yorks in a bit more detail. Not least of all, the toe-sucking scandal.
Yes, Fergie was, I think she was separated from Andrew. She wasn't living with him, was she, at that time? But she went on holiday to somewhere near Saint-Tropez with Beatrice and Eugenie and her so-called financial advisor, Johnny Brown, who I met, actually, the late Johnny Brown, I believe. And he was very smooth. Do have a glass of Cristal champagne, that sort of smooth, which is very nice. But and he seemed to have a real hold over Fergie. She turned to him for every sort of, what should I do? And then he would always have the answer. He was a very smooth-talking American. Well, anyhow, obviously he was a bit more than her financial advisor, and I believe that was a sort of James Whittaker moment, wasn't it, Dickie? James Whittaker was the sort of doyen of royal reporting in those days, and he and a French photographer found this ditch near their villa when they could plop in and they train the cameras on them. And the next thing they know is that Johnny Brown is sucking Fergie's toes. I think he was probably actually kissing them. And Beatrice and Eugenie were in the shot, and Fergie was topless, which, of course, in the south of France doesn't mean a thing. But shock horror back home. And poor old Fergie, meantime, was actually staying at Balmoral with the Queen. And it was the Mirror that came out the next day, despite Johnny Brown's efforts to stop publication. And they printed extra copies. I mean, it was a complete sensation. And Fergie had to walk down to breakfast at Balmoral. And she said to me, I looked round the table and I said, there, but for the grace of God, go the lot of you. Because at that moment, I think Diana was having an affair. I think that Princess Anne was having the affair with the Queen's equerry, Tim Lawrence. Yep. And then who else? We don't know who else was having an affair. But she said that, and I just thought, oh, my gosh, how ghastly it must have been.
And she was cast out, wasn't she, effectively, from that point on?
I mean, she was sent home, wasn't she? I mean, I think it was the Duke of Edinburgh who insisted that she had to leave.
Private Secretary collared her and said, I think you better pack your bags and go.
Yeah.
And she did go, and late Prince Philip would not have her in the same building as him.
Ever again.
Ever again. She was never... In fact, I don't think she ever went back to Balmoral until
after his death.
Yes.
And Princess Margaret had some pretty harsh words.
Well, she always had
for her as well, Katie.
But as Ingrid said, Princess Margaret's exploits in Mustique, there's a bit of Pot's kettle and black in all of this, isn't there?
There is a bit of
there really is. But you've got to admire Fergie's chutzpah, brazenness. I mean, there's no way I would have gone down to that breakfast. I mean, I would have been on the first train out of there, but she went down, she knew the papers were there, she went down anyway, and you think, my goodness, that does take some serious guts.
And actually, when you look at her now, she's remained loyal to the royal family throughout. Now we do see her back at Balmoral. We do see her at Sandringham.
The Queen used to sneak her into Balmoral when Prince Philip wasn't there.
Yes.
Do you remember that? There was
she was welcome back again.
Occasional pictures.
But not under the same roof as him.
Ingrid mentioned Princess Anne and Captain Mark Phillips. They divorced in 1992. In April of that year, their divorce finalised. And then she went on to marry
She married Tim Lawrence. It's quite interesting because there was a lot of hoo-ha in the media about why did they get married in Scotland. And it was very simple. The reason they got married in Scotland, she was divorced. Church of England wouldn't marry them in the UK. They wanted a church wedding, and the Church of Scotland had no problem with it. So that's why they got married. It was also a lot cheaper too because there were fewer guests.
So we've already had an awful lot that's gone on in the first part of 1992, haven't we? And then we come to June 1992, and we have Andrew Morton's book, Diana, Her True Story, published and exposing the state of the royal marriage, Katie.
Yes, but of course at the time it wasn't known, the extent of Diana's involvement wasn't known. But that was, I mean, it was right. I mean, that was still up before I'd even started doing this as a career. But I'm curious to know what the impact of Spare was compared to the Morton book, because I think for our generation of royal reporters, Sarah, Spare is the biggest publishing phenomenon in terms of royal scandal.
It had a tremendous impact.
And Dickie, I'm interested in your perspective, because you were there at that point. You were the Palace Press Secretary. Yeah. So what happened?
Well, what happened was that, everybody knows, the Sunday papers drop at Charing Cross Station in London on a Saturday night. So if you want to know what's in it, particularly if you know that there's going to be a serialisation, a royal serialisation, you're down there like a shot. 10 o'clock, pick up the paper, and then spend the rest of the night wondering what the hell you're going to do with it. She phoned me at 5 o'clock at Sunday morning. What do I do? What do I do? I said, ma'am, you've already done it. She said, what do you think of it? I said, don't go there. All I can suggest to you is don't pick up the phone today. Don't phone anybody. Don't go out. Don't even go out or go on the telephone Monday. You've got an engagement on Tuesday. I'll be with you, and we'll see how the ground lies then.
And how did it lie then? What was that engagement like?
Well, the first thing she did, she was being introduced by it was at a charitable event. The Lord Lieutenant was there in his fineries with his sword sticking out at the back and his medals, what medals he had, and she burst into tears. And it was very sad, but she did say, what do I do? I said, ma'am, you have done it. And I knew right away that she'd helped, although she denied it. I remember asking her, how did you help? I didn't do it. And she told her late brother-in-law, Lord Fellows. She told her sisters, Sarah McCorquodale and Jane Fellows. She told everybody that she had not helped Andrew Morton. Even the chairman of the Press Complaints Commission, Lord MacGregor, came out in support of her. And yet, a few months after that, it came out that she had helped.
And in the aftermath of that
And then
book,
Dickie, can I just say this? Because Dickie, didn't you have to fax? We're going back a long time now. You had to fax the newspapers to Prince Charles at Highgrove. I remember you telling me that.
Yeah, we had to sort of do cuttings because you didn't have mobile phones then, so you had to cut the story out, paste it on a piece of paper, and then fax it through to Highgrove. I don't know what his reaction was. I didn't feel anything coming from Highgrove, but I'm sure there would have been an eruption. Very famous Windsor temper, and in those days he used to go into orbit with them.
this image we're looking at here, 1991 on their Canada tour, I mean, in hindsight, you can see the divisions between the two of them there. After the book, there was no going back, really, was it? The relationships outside of the marriage became very public.
Can I just say something about that picture? You're talking about 1992. They went to Expo in Seville, Expo 92 in Seville, and they opened, or he did, open the British Pavilion there, and there was a wraparound terrace, and they stood on that terrace, and she was looking one way, he was looking the other way, and you could have driven a double-decker bus between them.
They couldn't even put on the show for the cameras at that point. And then, Ingrid, we had Squidgygate and we had Camilla Gate.
Well, Squidgygate was the first, I think, and it was a recording between Diana and one of her boyfriends, actually, so we discovered later. And
James Gilby.
James Gilby, yes, who was, we all thought was just a friend, but I think he was a bit more than that. And it wasn't offensive, but it went on. And then Diana started talking about how the Queen Mother didn't really like her and used to give her a funny look. And it was quite funny, actually. And then he kept calling her Squidgy, so that's why it became Squidgygate. And that erupted. This was sometime in the summer, I think. It just erupted. Because one of the newspapers had got hold of it, and although it wasn't offensive, it was, you know, it was very sort of intimate and revealing about the royal family. And she was saying how hard she worked for them and how they hated her and she hated them. And but it was done in a slightly jokey manner. As that was Diana's way, I mean. And then after, I think there was quite a gap of time, wasn't there, before Camilla Gate came out. Now,
that was November of '92.
That was horrifically embarrassing. First of all, that came out in Australia. I think it was one of the Australian New Idea or something, one of those magazines that published it, and the tape. And then it bounced, of course, here very, very quickly. And I think the editors of the newspapers really did think before they published it. It was already out there, though, so they did. And it was just cringe-making.
Excruciating.
But it did show, it was a conversation between Charles in one place, maybe Highgrove, and Camilla was staying with some friends of hers. And they were telling each other how much they missed each other, and she was telling him how wonderful he was and what a brilliant speech he'd given. She was being, you know, very, very supportive, which, of course, she still is to this day. And then he started, I cannot actually discuss it.
It's too awful, isn't it? But wasn't that the precursor to the Queen then writing to them and saying, this is enough?
Yeah.
I think even for her ability to...
You better go to the lawyers now.
More harm being done by them remaining together.
And you asked earlier, Sarah, how the Queen dealt with those sorts of scandals, and I can't remember who it was I spoke to, but someone who'd spent a lot of time with her who said she did have this incredible ability to compartmentalise.
I know who you spoke to, Lady
Elizabeth Anson, yes.
Is it? Yes. Thanks for reminding me, yes. It was a while ago. Yeah. But yes, you know, and I think that's very true. She did have that ability, but I think it got to a point where it was so excruciatingly embarrassing. I mean, that whole tampon gate, it's just awful. That was it, you know? She wrote to them and said, do it, get the divorce.
And then we had
the Panorama thing that did the divorce. It's all such a long time ago.
Yes.
It was then that happened. And then Diana did an interview for Panorama.
And that really was the final nail in the coffin.
That was a payback for Charles doing the interview the
Jonathan
previous
Dimbleby.
year
with Dimbleby.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, as we talked about television appearances and interviews,
they've never gone well.
They haven't learnt their lessons from them. And at the end, towards the end of 1992, towards the end of November that year, we had the fire at Windsor Castle, Katie, and that kind of seemed to sum up.
It was like a metaphor, wasn't it, for everything that had happened in that annus horribilis. You know, I mean, what a cruel year for the Queen when you think about it. You know, her favourite residence.
Yeah, but what was even
fire.
crueler, I mean, she really was dumped in it, because what was even crueler, and I was down there on the day of the fire, we had about 400 or 500 media there, television, photographers, reporters. But the following day, an MP came down who was head of Department of Culture, Media and Culture, and Peter Brooks. And he was briefed beforehand by everybody at the palace, by the Lord Chamberlain, by the Keeper of the Privy Purse, who's the money man, by the Private Secretary, by his own PPS, not to say anything. Not because there was any secret, but the sort of questions that were going to come was, how much is it going to cost? Who's going to do it? Who's going to pay for it? So the first question that came out, and I think it was BBC, said, who's going to pay for it? And he said, the government will pay. Well, the world collapsed on the late Queen. It brought such anger in this country. People saying, why should we pay for it? She lives there, she should pay for it. It's a bit like saying the Prime Minister pay for Downing Street if it burns down. But it took a long time to get over that, and that's where the paying the income tax came.
And Ingrid, when she made that speech, it was at the Guildhall, wasn't it, I think? And she called that year, the phrase that I've used here, and it has become so familiar to all of us now, the annus horribilis. And you could see on her face and hear in her voice the emotion at getting to that point.
She actually had laryngitis that day.
Did she?
Yeah, which added to it.
And this rare moment of weakness, really, from her reflecting.
She was very vulnerable that day. I know she had flu and laryngitis, so she was feeling very unwell, but it's never, never stopped her before. But I think she was so hurt by the British people that she'd actually devoted her life, given up motherhood, everything too, and yet one thing, and of course Windsor Castle isn't hers, she's a custodian. Immediately, people leap on the bandwagon and say, well, she lives there, she's got plenty of money, why shouldn't she pay for it? So she was deeply, deeply hurt, and then everything else that had gone wrong that year sort of really tumbled in on her.
What did she say? That she wouldn't look back on it with undiluted joy?
Pleasure.
Undiluted pleasure, yeah. She was quite a wordsmith in that respect. She did get it right, but I think you're right, Sarah. I think it was one of the times when we really saw emotion and actually pain in her face and her voice. This institution that she believes in, that DNA of duty that runs through her blood, and she's got, 3 out of 4 of her children's marriages that haven't worked out. Her home catches fire. The public have turned against her. But at that point, most people would think, what's the point? What's the point of doing it? But she never did.
And that takes us on to 1997, because, of course, we had the death of Princess Diana in August of 1997. The Queen then received the news of that at Balmoral and made the decision to stay at Balmoral and not to return to London. And it was another rare instance where she found herself being criticised by the public and against the public mood, Katie, at that point.
And very unfairly so, because, yes, I suppose she did. I think it was probably the first time she'd put self/family before duty, because had she put duty first, I suppose she would have come back to London, to the palace.
And she would have been criticised.
Damned if you do,
yes.
damned if you don't.
And,
Exactly.
but as far as she was concerned, she was doing her duty. She was doing her duty as a grandmother to look after these little boys.
We see that now, and I think the majority of people do accept that now. But at the time, Ingrid, the clamouring, where is our Queen? Your country needs you. Your people need you.
Well, the Queen did what she'd always done in times of stress and trouble. She followed tradition, and traditionally, within a death in the royal family, although Diana wasn't really part of it anymore, she still was the mother of the future king. They shut down. They close shutters, and they just keep to themselves, and they go to church. And the boys went to church, which was also criticised. But that's what they wanted to do. That's what they'd always done. So so far, so good. But that was only one day, and then the clamour started. And I mean,
started about midweek, and I remember going out in front of the palace. I put a jacket on because it was particularly hot, and I was listening to reporters interviewing people. The question was, should the Queen be in London? Yes, of course she should be in London is the natural answer. But if you prefix it and say she's looking after her grandchildren who've just lost their mum, do you think it's right staying up there? Would have been a completely different answer. But you ask the question for the answer you want to create the story that you want, and that's what they did.
She did come back, Dickie, and then she made that televised address to the nation.
She did, and I was alongside her when she did come back. She came back, we went to St James's Palace first. She apologised to people waiting to sign the books of condolence. She went down to the palace and she went into an enclosure that we'd set up. Spent about 40 minutes there, and on the way out, and reading inscriptions, putting flowers down, she and Prince Philip. On the way out, there was a young girl there. She was about 11, a girl called Katie Jones. And she had some flowers. And the Queen said, "Can I put these down for you?" And Katie said, "No, ma'am, these are for you." And as she left the enclosure, we made eye contact. And I knew what was going through. And I just said, "That was fine, ma'am. That was fine." And I walked through with her to her car, and she went into the palace. 2 hours later, the live broadcast. Now, the genesis of that, originally, the film crew wanted to film it in the centre room, which is the room that overlooks the Mall, the balcony, and it's the wrong room because all you see from it is the top of the Queen Victoria Memorial. I said, we're going to do it in the Chinese dining room. Anybody visiting the palace, extreme right-hand side, first floor. And we're going to have the windows open, the doors open. No, can't do that, too noisy. Exactly, that's why we're doing it. There's no separation on this broadcast between those watching on television and those down on the ground watching it on television and can see the Queen, the back of the Queen. And at the end of it, there was applause, very loud applause. She'd actually got it right.
Just quickly, Katie, before we move on, do you think when we look back and we're discussing the 90s in particular, and we talk about the difficulties the royal family have had in recent years, does it all make what's been happening lately seem quite small in comparison, really?
I don't know if it makes it feel quite small, but I think the Queen had to weather an awful lot in that decade. And I think, you know, that moment that Dickie just sort of speaks about so powerfully, actually, it's so evocative. You know, and you realise how close she was to losing the public support. You know, in that long, long reign, it had never got to that point before.
Never wavered.
It never did. But the public mood turned, and I don't think it's ever done that before. I don't think it's done it since. So, yes, I think we probably do look back at that as a pivotal moment.
And I think we've got to be thankful for that. In that day, we're lucky we didn't have social media.
Yes.
It would have been.
It would have taken a different turn.
It would have taken a completely different.
Oh, it would have been terrible.
Particularly with what was still to come, because after a very difficult few years for the Queen and the whole family, there were yet more controversial times ahead, with the relationship between Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles taking centre stage. The tabloids hated her, but what did the Queen really feel about her?
The Queen called her, this is that much maligned woman, and she knew Camilla was very good for her son. At the time, I think the Queen had quite a lot of doubts about her son's actual ability. You know, she thought that he just, you know, led this very extravagant life and he loved all his charities and things, but she wondered if he had enough backbone. And she knew that Camilla gave him this backbone. But what worried her was what everybody else was saying. Also, the Queen had known Camilla since she was a teenager, or probably before. Because the Parker Bowles family and the Queen Mother were very close. So she approved of Camilla emotionally, but she knew that the public were not ready to accept her at all.
Isn't it remarkable then, Katie, now when we look at this sort of a modern day image, to think of that transition from, you know, this toxic mistress, the wicked stepmother,
yes,
to now Queen Camilla.
Queen Camilla, who, you know, when the King was off with going through his cancer treatment and Princess Wales was out of action, you know, this was the woman keeping the royal show on the road and keeping everything running. And I remember
smoothly.
writing... And smoothly, and with a smile on her face. I remember writing about that for Vanity Fair and just thinking, well, this is just the most extraordinary metamorphosis. And just, you know, just to go back to that point when, you know, there was this whole operation Camilla Parker Bowles in place at the palace to introduce Camilla as you know, Charles's partner, you know, and of course at the moment of Diana's death, that was all just put on the back. I mean, parked, put on the back burner. You know, we're never going to talk about this again. Such was the public mood. So when you consider that, to her actually, to the coronation, to that moment when she was crowned, it is extraordinary.
There was a lot of the Queen's hand, actually, in encouraging public acceptance eventually, wasn't there, Dickie?
Yes.
From the appointment of Camilla to the Privy Council, to the Order of the Garter, for example, and then to say that it was her sincere wish that Camilla should be Queen Consort, not just Princess Consort.
No, I mean, when Clarence House announced that in 2005, February 2005, that they were going to get married, got engaged, and when he becomes king, she'll be known as Princess Consort. There's no such thing as a Princess Consort. They made it up.
It was a fudge, really, wasn't it?
It was a
public
fudge because Diana had only died 7 years beforehand, so it was a fudge. And fortunately, the late Queen lived as long as she did, and saying at the time of her anniversary of her accession, the Platinum Jubilee, that is her wish that Camilla be known as Queen Consort. She did set the seal. She gave Camilla a family order, which is quite something. And she had come round. As Ingrid rightly said, she'd known Camilla for years. Her son used to play polo with Andrew. Prince Philip used to play polo with Andrew. So, you know, the polo is the attachment. It was just unfortunate that everything that happened with the death of Diana, it was the relationship put on the back burner.
Should we talk about happier times? Because we've dwelled on some very long and very difficult years, haven't we? But after those 2 decades of challenges for the Queen, her Diamond Jubilee marked a new and more stable chapter for the monarchy. 2012, the Diamond Jubilee year, Dickie. Would you say this was a high point in her reign?
I think the highest point in her reign was that sequence with James Bond.
Oh, at the London Olympics opening ceremony.
I mean, that was amazing. And setting the seal on the balcony appearance that only working royals, unfortunately Prince Philip had sort of been marched off to hospital, having got drenched on that river pageant.
On Gloriana.
And you know, they saw hundreds of thousands of people lining the Thames getting wet. Not once did they get under cover themselves. They stood out there in the open, and unfortunately Prince Philip went in with a urinary infection. But she did set the seal for the future, only working royals. And that's the way it's been ever since.
And you mentioned minus the Duke of Edinburgh, because he'd, of course, had to go into hospital after that river pageant. And then we had that very poignant moment where the Queen had to head into St Paul's Cathedral for the service of Thanksgiving. Without him.
But not only that, you could see what was going through her and you could feel what was going through her, because as she walked up the steps, normally her bag is there in the crook of her left arm. It was hanging at the end of her right arm as she walked up the steps. And I thought that was quite telling.
When we talked about Camilla and her acceptance, actually it was Camilla who went in the carriage on the way back from St Paul's alongside the Queen.
That was a moment. I think that was the first time that had ever happened, and I think she used that Diamond Jubilee to really send out some important messages. The moment with Camilla riding alongside her in the carriage, as Dickie said, that moment of the working royals only being up there on the balcony. You know, when you consider, you know, fast forwarding to the Platinum Jubilee, those balcony appearances are so important. They're not just about a great photo call. These are going down in the history books. These are those milestone moments. And of course, we just had the royal wedding.
We had,
which has just been wonderful.
And we got the news in 2012 that there was to be a royal baby, Prince George, born in the summer of 2013.
It was a real cracker of a year. And we had the Olympics, and we had William and Harry and Catherine all looking so happy together. I mean, I look back at 2012 and think that was a cracker of a year.
And the Olympics, I mean, Dickie
and
mentioned...
my daughter was born, so it was
my son.
Yeah, there you go.
But Dickie, you mentioned, of course, the high point of the Olympics, which was the Queen, you know, parachuting in to the opening ceremony, but also on a family level as well. For Zara Phillips, she won a medal at the London
silver,
Olympics.
didn't she?
She won a silver and was presented with it by her mother, Princess Anne. So it was a real moment of pride.
It really was.
As a family.
It really was. It was a great year.
And of course, we did really well in the Olympics that year. So it was a real upper year after a few stumbly ones, I suppose you could call them.
Definitely. Media relations as well. I mean, after the 1990s and the tabloid scandals and whatever else, there we have the Queen interacting in a way in the opening ceremony that we would never.
Well, don't you remember we got invited to the palace to go and meet the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, didn't we?
Yes, and
in the run up to the jubilee. That had never happened before.
No.
I remember we had some wonderful, off the record, but drinks with William and Catherine when we were travelling to Canada. It all felt like everyone was starting on a new page. And I remember after the royal wedding, I remember seeing... oh gosh, I completely blanked on his name. Who was it? Miguel Head.
Yes.
And Jamie Lowther Pinkerton. You know, all of the press team sort of almost skipping across the Mall because they were so delighted with how everything had gone and the coverage.
This fresh young couple that they knew that they could sell to the world, didn't they? I mean,
there's a real sense of. I think it's just a real sense of optimism.
We've got a story to tell here, and it's a positive story.
And they needed it.
They certainly did. It was 2022 when the late Queen passed away, September 2022, just months after celebrating her Platinum Jubilee, and King Charles III acceded to the throne. 2 years on, it hasn't gone entirely according to plan, has it? But how has he done, Katie?
Well,
so far,
I think he's done amazingly well. I mean, Ingrid, we were speaking about this, weren't we, for a piece I was writing for Vanity Fair? But I think you said it was the fact that he hadn't changed too much. That while there have been changes, of course there have. We knew that he was going to want to be the eco king. You know, we saw him talk at COP. I mean, we've seen him do things that his mother wouldn't have done. Shake up of the royal residences, royal finances, all of that I think we expected of him. That sort of streamlining. But he stayed so true to the course as well. And I think there was a risk of two things when he came to the throne. One of apathy, that people just wouldn't care. And one that I suppose the other obvious one is that he just wouldn't live up to the Queen and her legacy. But in fact, by continuing the traditions and that stability and that continuity, I think he's just got it right.
I don't know about you, Ingrid. I thought he set the tone right from the outset when he arrived back at Buckingham Palace after his mother's death. And he stopped his car short and he got out and he shook hands with members of the public. And there was a real warmth from him towards members of the public. And you could see the emotion on his face when he heard God Save the King.
Absolutely.
For the very first time. And I think people felt that
I think
he'd opened himself up.
Yes, I think they felt... And there was a wonderful moment, I don't know if it was that time or a bit later, when this woman said, "Can I give you a hug?" And he said, "Oh, yes," and that hug was amazing. Now,
it was that very moment, that first walkabout. She pulled him forward, gave him a hug and a peck on the cheek. And his security didn't interfere.
And you could see he didn't know how he was going to be received at that moment.
He didn't. I was there on that day. I was standing outside the gates of the palace, and there were so many people. I was like, if there was a crowd surge or something, there were so many people. And yet you could almost hear a pin drop when the car pulled up. And I thought, well, are they going to applaud? Are they going to boo? I mean, you don't know how people are going to react to that.
And he didn't know either. This was the whole point. People might have just been completely quiet and held up their phones.
And then suddenly there was this applause, and it started at the front, and it just rippled back.
Effect.
Yeah, it was actually a really moving moment, and you could just see him visibly.
Spine tingling.
Yeah, and you could see him visibly relax and realise his first step out of that car as king here in England.
Yeah. In my early days, when I joined Buckingham Palace, my remit, besides being one of the late Queen's press secretaries, I was Charles and Diana's press secretary. And I'd lost count the number of times journalists, people, whatever, you say, well, what kind of king will he make? Well, he was an incredibly good Prince of Wales. He was a people person, always been a people person. We saw that on that first walkabout. We saw it on subsequent walkabout when he stopped the car in the Mall on the Saturday to do another walkabout. But as Prince of Wales, youth was his prime target. He wanted to help young people get on the property ladder, get on the work ladder, get off the streets, not become homeless. He gave soft loans. Idris Elba, everybody knows who Idris Elba, got a soft loan from the Prince's Trust. Without it, he wouldn't have gone to drama school. And he's just carried on this thing, being a people person today, which is wherever he goes now, that period when he couldn't, when he initially had cancer, but since the April, the Easter service, he's been walkabouts. He's just enjoyed meeting people. He's enjoyed talking to people. And he's just carrying on the way he was before with a bigger responsibility.
And of course, he's got the visit to Australia and Samoa coming up, something which kind of looked in doubt earlier on this year with his cancer diagnosis, Ingrid. But how important do you think it is for him to be out and to be seen?
Well, he knows better than anyone that it's very important for him to be out and to be seen and to be visibly being more tactile than his mother, because he's a different generation. And I think, as Katie said, I mean, you could see him, he visibly enjoys the adoration, I suppose you could, or the, you know. And of course, remember, particularly in the Diana days, in the early Diana days, nobody was interested in talking to Prince of Wales. They only wanted Diana. And he had several years of that. And he used to make these sort of wry remarks, well, if I could, have two wives, then they could go either side of the road, but he wasn't happy about it. Yeah. So this is I think it's the first time that he's actually been in his own right,
and
completely in his own. And people are there
for him.
And people, yeah, exactly. As you said in your book. We mustn't forget about your book.
I know, and Katie,
yes.
I want to finish with you because
yes.
it is called the New Royals.
Yes.
So how do we think the New Royals have done so far and are going to continue to do as we go ahead? And we are in times of uncertainty still, we have to say, aren't we?
Yes, we absolutely are. And, the one thing we know about the king, and I think we all agree he's doing a great job, is that, he is a king in a hurry. He was before his cancer diagnosis, even more so now. It's a reminder, of course, for him of his own mortality. But I think, when you look at that lineup, the succession is secure. I think there is every reason to be optimistic. Of course, the Prince of Wales doesn't want his time to come any sooner. He wants to watch his children grow up. I know that's really important for him. I mean, he wants Louis to be at least 16, 17 and, well on course to adulthood before his time comes. But, we will have to wait and see what happens. But whatever happens, the late Queen Elizabeth ensured that the succession was secure, that the House of Windsor, the future is there. And I think despite everything, and when you look at this extraordinary year, because it has been, there is still that sense of optimism because there is continuity. And within the House of Windsor, there is, thankfully, longevity and very good genes.
Well, that is all we've got time for today's show. Thank you so much to my guests, Dickie, Ingrid, and of course, Katie, whose book, The New Royals, Queen Elizabeth's Legacy and the Future of the Crown, is out in paperback in the UK and the US and really does deserve a place on your bookshelf.